Today, I'll be using this old canister I found to make a fairy staircase terrarium. And if you have something similar laying around your house, you could probably make one too. As always, I'll start with my drainage layer made from aquarium sand that I get from my local pet store. I like to create a design in my drainage layer, so I'll go in with a scoop of white sand and I'll just run it along the side of the glass all the way along the perimeter to create a design. And this is completely optional. You don't have to do this step. You could do just one color of sand. You could do multiple colors of sand. It's purely for aesthetic. The one thing I would recommend is that you don't have the white sand next to the soil layer, because once you water it, it could discolor your sand. And that's why I always add an extra layer of tan sand. And once I'm happy with the drainage layer, I'll add quite a few scoops of my terrarium soil, and then I'll get it wet with some distilled water to help it hold its shape. And I'll create a mound by pressing it into the side of the glass. For my hardscape, I'll be adding this piece of driftwood and I'll just press it into the soil. Then I'll use some of the rocks that I collected from outside to create my fairy staircase. While I was out hiking, I also foraged for some moss, and I'll be using that in my terrarium. And I like to use a variety of moss in my projects to give them some more texture. And the majority of the moss that I do find comes from these hikes from around my city. And I really do think that if you were looking for it, you'd be surprised at how much moss you can find. But if you're having a hard time finding moss in your area, I'll add a link to some in the description of this video. I'll also be adding some British soldier, and it's actually a lichen, but you'll find lichen growing in a lot of the same areas that you'd find moss growing. And I'll just add it along the sides of the fairy staircase as if it was planted, because it kind of reminds me of flowers. And I'm just using the end of a skewer stick to create a little hole before I add my little clump of lichen. I'll also be adding some taller moss to give the terrarium even more texture in just a couple places. Then I'll add some smaller stones all along the staircase. And I'll use a small paintbrush to tidy up the pathway. I'll add any last-minute final touches of moss. And I don't really know where the staircase is leading, but I think it looks pretty cool. The last thing to do is to mist down the entire terrarium with some distilled water before replacing the cork top to help hold in the humidity so that this fairy staircase terrarium can thrive.